Welcome to the Evolved Leadership Podcast, where we speak to business owners and executives who make the world a better place. You'll hear experienced and successful leaders share powerful stories and insights that will help you evolve as a leader in your own journey. Welcome to the show. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Tim Munden. Tim was the Chief Learning Officer of Unilever until very recently, and previously held a number of Global Vice President of HR roles in the organisation. Tim is now moving on after 28 years at Unilever to his next project, which he might talk a bit more about today. Tim is passionate about encouraging leaders to embrace a leadership model that helps people to be more human at work, as well as meeting the needs of the complex, fast-moving and disruptive 21st century leadership landscape. Additionally, Tim has also spent a good deal of time in the last 20 years running programs in transformational leadership for young people around the globe through an international youth leadership charity that he was instrumental in founding in the early 2000s. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dave. Lovely to be here with you.
It's really great to have you on. So, did I get it right? Is there anything else you'd like to add on who you are?
No, it's a great summary. I think the only other thing I'd add, which I always start with, is my purpose, which is to nurture deeply human possibility. And I think that underpins all the work that I've tried to do over the last 20, 30 years.
I'd really like to hear more about that today. So why don't we start there? When you talk about purpose and human possibility, what do you mean by those terms?
So I think purpose is becoming a really well-used term, maybe slightly overused, in that sometimes I think it's used with it and loses its meaning. Purpose for me is in every human being, we have a drive to do things that are meaningful. Purposefulness is part of being human. And I think we're seeing a resurgence in that in the world at the moment. I think we're seeing a renewed focus on it. We're seeing it post-pandemic. The so-called Great Resignation, I think, is an expression of people wanting to work on things and in a way that is resonant with who they feel themselves to be, their purpose. Purpose, I think, asks the question, why? Why do you fundamentally do it? What does success look like for you? What fundamentally motivates you? So I think it is a growing theme that individuals and organizations are seeking. Organizational purpose, then, I think, is an organization trying to really explore why it exists. And if you can connect organizational purpose and individual purpose, that's the motivational chemistry, the alchemy you're really looking for. Yeah.
So, without breaking any boundaries of confidentiality, you're an expert in Unilever, having been there for 28 years. How connected would you say people were, in terms of individual purpose and organizational purpose? How connected were those two generally, throughout your time there? Did it change, over your 28 years? Was it more present in some divisions and not in others? What can you comment on there without, breaking any confidentiality that you have?
So Unilever, I think, is a company that's well known for its organizational purpose to make sustainable living commonplace. I think that particular form of its purpose is now about 13 years or so old, 12, 13 years old. And I think having that really clear formulation helped to really encapsulate what the purpose was. I think it's then been really clearly deployed into the strategy. And that helps also then for it to flow into what people do every day. Leaders have been explicitly given the opportunity to lead from purpose. And then Unilever sought to scale purpose. So we created a purpose workshop, which 56,000 people have completed, an opportunity to discover your own purpose, which actually Unilever is now making available kind of outside of the organization because it's so important. Great. So I think purpose, for me, if you get purpose in an organization right, you do those three things. You embed it in strategy, you embed it in leadership, and you embed it in the culture. And that then helps to bring it to life. So I think, to answer your question a little bit, yes, absolutely, over the last half of the time I was in the business, it has absolutely intensified, both in all three of those areas: strategy, leadership, and culture. I mean, I think the depth of some of the leadership development work that we've been able to do has been really profound. Helping leaders to come to a deep sense of their own purpose, helping not just leaders, or actually in the 21st century, I think we're redefining what leadership is. In fast-moving, agile organizations where there's less and less structure and hierarchy, everybody's a leader. It's what holds the organization together. And I think so the depth of work we've done, 56,000 people completed a purpose workshop in Unilever.
Wow.
I think that's depth.
Yep.
And I think also we came to this, started using this language for leadership, that there's an inner game and an outer game. And that concept of the inner game gave us an opportunity we had that language for the last 4 or 5 years. I was in that role of Chief Learning Officer, and it massively helped us, particularly when COVID came, to have deep conversations. So one of the components of the inner game, as Unilever describes it, is personal mastery. The ability to bring your best self, the commitment to always bring your best self. In there is self-regulation, emotional intelligence, managing your well-being, your energy. Because we had that language, we were able to have really deep conversations. And we trained a large cohort of mindfulness champions to spread kind of mindfulness practices around the organization, because that's a key component of this personal mastery. So I feel that nothing is ever about one person. Everything is a team effort in organizations and in life. But I do think certainly we've got to a depth of thinking about what leadership means and helping people to be leaders that I think is really profound.
Well, that's really great to hear, and very inspiring to hear that kind of work is going on in a large organisation, and that you've been at it, in a very committed way, and to the point where 56,000 people have been through an experience with you that has the intent of transformation and depth. So thank you very much for sharing that. In terms of yourself, Tim, you as a leader and your own leadership journey. What has your leadership journey been? Yeah, and what have the greatest challenges been for you in your own journey?
Yeah, so I think the last 5-6 years, particularly maybe 7-8, I've really done a lot of work on myself. Partly just seeing the need of what was going on around me and how I needed to shift to meet it, but also faced with recognizing 8 years ago that I was experiencing post-traumatic stress from an incident earlier in my life in which I'd been in a really bad car accident. And I started to realize that some of my behaviors were not driven by me in the moment. They were driven by emotions from the past that I hadn't processed and dealt with. I was overly emotional, extreme in my response to things. I experienced very bad nightmares for most of the kind of last 25 years or so. I just thought I was a bit of a funny fella, and I didn't put it all together in a picture and go, hang on a second, there's something else going on here.
Yes.
That realization that I was experiencing post-traumatic stress and the desire to go get help, which actually takes a bit, because a lot of the stigma I found of mental ill health is actually self-stigma. I didn't see myself as someone who needed help, who had a thing that had a name. But the great thing about realizing you're experiencing a thing that has a name is there is help available, much more than people realize. But that journey of working on that post-traumatic stress has been really, I think, really transformational. Partly because after a certain amount of time, I started to tell my story, and I put a film on LinkedIn, just really to encourage others to go get help and not to feel
fantastic.
Stigmatized. But that act, I think, shifted my leadership, because I started to turn up authentically. And it enabled very real conversations with all kinds of people. I talk about my experience in leadership programs, events, and speeches, and virtually every time someone would follow me out of the room and say, "Can I just chat?" So I think that was a big shift that I work on myself. I think part of what was happening to me was I had come out of this car accident, and at the point at which I thought I was going to die, I thought I had a sense of shame that I hadn't fulfilled my potential. And I said to myself, well, that was a really awful experience, but I'm alive. So the next time I die, I'm going to make sure I don't have shame. I'm going to fulfill my potential. Now, there was an element of good in that. It led me to really work on things, such as the leadership programs you were talking about before, Dave. But actually, it was also an awful thing that I did to myself, because what is your level of potential? Is it here?
Yeah.
Is it here? What is that? And in fact, I just drove myself hard because I was trying to make sure I didn't die with shame. And any time anything didn't go according to how I felt it should go, that fear came back and I overreacted.
Right.
And so just learning how to really, how do I put it, work with real purpose, not with some of that programming, to be much more fluid about how things go and how things work out, has been a big shift. And to show up honestly, the biggest thing it taught me in the 20th century, I think leadership was about having the answer. The leader knew how to do stuff. In the 21st century, I think leaders don't necessarily know how to do stuff.
Yes.
Leadership is actually about people want leaders who are able to create the space of psychological safety in which other people can generate ideas. It's moved from perfection to vulnerability.
Yes.
And I think embracing your vulnerability is a big shift.
It's so refreshing to hear you use the language of vulnerability and to set the context of the 21st century shift, where things are ambiguous and that they are uncertain and they are constantly changing more than ever before. And that is the environment in which organizational leaders operate today. It's not going to change. That is it. That's what you're going to face every day. And, that comes with a different kind of challenge to when, there was greater certainty or predictability of experience. And I think, the emotions that we experience as leaders, being vulnerable about those and being honest about what we feel is a big part of how to effectively manage that and perform optimally as leaders. So, you've just talked, really clearly about your own personal journey and how, your own vulnerability was really a part of your own transformation and moving to a different place. And it certainly sounds like a more comfortable place than previously. What about your work with others? How have you taken that insight, and your own experience around vulnerability forward to the leaders that you work with in your own role?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of ways, I suppose. Partly trying to create spaces for leaders I work with to really show up as they are. Certainly in our interactions, to give them the space to really be as they are, to share everything that they kind of have going on. And I think, as you know, as a coach, creating deep spaces for people to really reflect and be themselves. You can't be an effective coach if people are showing up trying to kind of feeling they need to look good or put on a certain front or a certain impression. You have to create a space in which people are safe to be humble and vulnerable. And I think that has really, I've put a lot of focus on that. I suppose I've also come at this slightly with a refreshed sense of the possibility for transformation that everyone has. I was well into my 40s before I realized that I had post-traumatic stress and needed to work on it.
Right.
The events had happened 20 plus years before, it was quite deep seated. I'm now pretty much healed. And I think it really, I suppose, reinforced for me the space, the possibility of healing and transformation that we all have, whatever level of maturity, seniority that we've got, and that I think is a massively encouraging. And again, as developers of and educators and coaches of people, we've got to have that deep belief. I think it really reinforced that for me.
Fantastic. I mean, when you do work around traumatic experience, as in the work of leadership development, you're up in front of a group of executives running programs. My experience is you don't get into people's personal traumas, but yet we're all wounded individuals, and some of us have more serious traumas, but we all have our own traumas. And I've never worked with a client who hasn't, and of course I have my own in my own journey. How do you advise people, who are inspired by your story and it identifies, okay, there's something for me to work on there. I really recognize, a pattern here, and Tim's story is highlighting that for me. What do you recommend to people? Because I'm guessing it's not something that you can go into at least to the core of working with people's traumas. But when people become aware of that, what do you recommend they do about it as leaders?
Yeah, mainly do something. A whole range of things, Dave. It depends on the exact situation. Mm-hmm. So if somebody is feeling what you could describe as mental ill health, whether that's stress, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, I say every time, go see a specialist, go see a doctor. Yeah. Depends which country of the world you're in. And of course, we've got to remember that you and I are sitting in the UK and Australia with extremely sophisticated public health systems. And in fact, both countries are, however we might think it needs to be better, the stigma of mental ill health is less in our countries than it is in most other countries in the world.
Yes.
That said, it's still very present. But first off, I would say, whatever your public health system is, your healthcare system, go get help. There is there are well over 100 different sorts of talking therapy alone. And I've used, for post-traumatic stress, I've been using EMDR with a psychologist, which most people have never heard of. So there are more therapies and treatments than we know about, most of us. So go get help is step one.
Yes.
Go see your local doctor, go see a specialist, get help. If the sense is that it's not, it's showing up in a more leadership context, and that can happen sometimes. Still, some of those therapies might be important and relevant. There are lots of things available. We've started to use a whole range of things. So we have shadow work based on Jungian psychology with leaders to help them to reflect on past experience. Yes. Very, very powerful. Again, you have to find people who are deeply expert and who you trust. We use immersions. So I think one of the growing niches of leadership development is an immersion. So rather than a coach where you might meet over 18 hours of coaching over a 6-month period or something, you would meet for 3 days, one leader, 2 or 3 coaches. And what I find that does is it helps you to go very, very deep, because you're in an intensive burst, rather than one of the risks of coaching is that the leader's so busy that they kind of not too much happens in between the sessions. Yeah. Now, obviously, the upside of coaching is that over a period of time, you can experiment with new things and you can embed the behavior. But the immersion, the different shape of development experience can be very powerful. And also you can put in there a psychologist or a psychotherapist in the mix of practitioners. So we've been using those from a whole number of different providers. So there's different forms of coaching, such as the shadow work. There's different forms of development experience like immersions. I think this is a massively exciting time to be in leadership development for two reasons. One is, never has leadership been more important in the world, because of the ambiguity and the disruption and the complexity. And second, never has there been such a richness of innovation in how we support leaders to grow and to meet the needs that they're there to face.
So, that's really interesting that you talk about the immersions, and you and I have both, in our background, had a lot of immersion experiences. I know, and an insight that I came to also is just how incredibly transformational an immersion experience can be, as opposed to like a weekly or fortnightly conversation. And I think my view is the ideal is that you do both, because I know, having done so many immersion experiences in my life, I would come out at the end super inspired, and sometimes the high would last up to a few months, often not quite that long, but it would eventually dip if there was no ongoing support. And my personal view is to combine immersive experiences with ongoing support at a frequency that works for people, so that the inspiration from the intensive experience stays fresh and it's not lost. You were starting to go into the future of leadership, which is what I wanted to ask about next. Without pretending to have a crystal ball, what do you genuinely feel are the biggest challenges that leaders are going to face in the future, whether it's 10, 15, 100 years, whatever time frame you want to speak to?
I can only speak to what I see emergent now. And this is by no means unique. I think a lot of people are putting their best crystal glasses on and having a look. And I think what we're seeing is shifts like the one I mentioned before, away from the idea that the leader is the one who has the answers, to leaders who create the space in which people can find the answers together. Away from the leader as the person who's done it, never made a mistake, an unbroken stream of success to a senior position. That model, I think, is gone. I think people want leaders who can talk authentically about their challenges, who can talk about the things they tried that didn't work. Because now I think the reality is, if you're not you're trying things that don't work, you're not experimenting enough, and your solutions aren't radical enough. So I think there's a shift there. I think in terms of what we're asking leaders to do, we've known for years that leadership is situational, that what effective looks like depends on the context you're in, the kinds of people, the kinds of problem, the kind of time frame. Context is what really dictates what good leadership looks like. Our contexts are changing, and the contexts are increasingly complex. So I find the model very helpful of thinking that complicated is a problem that is technically difficult, but which, if you have enough technical knowledge and you can break the problem down, you can find the answer. The tax code, it's complicated. Law is complicated. Data management is complicated. But actually what we're struggling with are different sorts of problem in the world which are complex. There is no single answer. There is a whole range of different perspective on what that could be. And in fact, it contains a whole lot of different disciplines needed to try and understand it. Leaders are wrestling with complex problems, and therefore we need to engage the skills and insights of many people. That's a change. I think at the same time, there's a change that leaders are expected to run organizations, as you were referring to earlier, that do contribute more broadly to society than just profit and growth. Leaders are expected to also create a workplace in which there are potentially 4 or 5 generations of people and who are wanting a more purposeful experience. We have generations joining the workforce now who don't want to be managed by a person behind a desk, behind a door with a job title on the door. They want a relationship with a leader who is coaching them and giving them meaningful work. And at the same time, organizations are changing. In the 20th century, structure was the way in which we managed organizations. It made them nice and consistent and stable. But now, of course, structure slows you down. And to innovate at speed and to solve complex, disruptive problems, structure doesn't always help you. So we're shifting to more fluid forms of organization in which behavior and values, culture, is more of the organizing principle than structure.
Yeah.
All of that changes leadership. And I think so we need leaders who are purpose-driven, who are able to deal with ambiguity, with self-confidence, aren't threatened by it, who can make a plan on Monday and tear it up on Thursday because the world has changed, who knows that something they learned in the year 2000 might no longer be true and are willing to give up that certainty. And I think all of that means we need leaders who have a more profound inner game, are able to draw deeply on reserves of resilience, but also know that real resilience lies in reaching out to people around them and for resources, who are resilient, who are present, who are able to generate inner clarity and space. I think those are the big shifts. The inner game of leadership, always important, is now probably the thing that makes the difference.
I would totally agree. And, as you were speaking, I was listening and remembering a number of clients I've worked with. And what I wanted to ask you was that there are situations where a particular leader has those qualities that you spoke about, and they're certainly committed to working on them. They're aware that that's the work they need to do, and they're committed to evolving and growing in that way. But their CEO is not. And their CEO can be a very rigid and inflexible person, or whoever is their superior. What advice would you give to leaders who are self-aware enough, to know that those are the qualities, what you were speaking about, that they need to be working on and focusing on, but their superior, I don't really like that term. Let's say generally it's the CEO, if you're talking about a senior executive, is not at all on that page. What do they do?
Look, I think the kind of recipe for leadership we've just been talking about is the way you get success in the world at the moment. It's the way you deliver sustainable performance. So I think in the end, results speak for themselves. So I think have deep belief in the approach to leadership you believe is right. Follow it, and the results will follow, and that's what in the end speaks. So I think it's just about staying the course, in all honesty, and also always retaining the ability to have dialogue. You can't decide who you work for some of the time, but you can take responsibility for how you show up with them. And the art of dialogue, of really helping a person to speak, to see what they really need, what they really believe, and I think is very powerful.
Yeah. And of course, there is always, if you've really exhausted all reasonable avenues and have made your best efforts, it is your decision as to whether you continue to stay with that organisation or not, or whether maybe there may be an organisation that is a much better fit for what you want to create in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's been said, I think it was Marcus Buckingham, wasn't it, some years ago, that people don't leave organisations, they leave leaders, they leave bosses.
Exactly.
I think there's some truth to that. I do think increasingly, though, it's also about purpose and purposefulness. And do people find that they can express what matters to them, particularly in that organisation? So I think people leave leaders and they leave organisations for purpose. Yes,
absolutely. And I still want to ask, there is a huge number of examples, but what inspires you most? Just pick one, whether it's political or, I know, for instance, Shell. I think you were the influence that led me to read Joseph Jaworski's Synchronicity, where they talk about Shell being involved in bringing the right people together in the world. That was a significant part of ending apartheid in South Africa. at one point. Whether it's that sort of scale of story. I know you're aware of a lot of these kinds of really high level humanity-based leadership conversations or projects. What's one that really inspires you to think of, and that you just want to call out here?
That's a really good question. I think I'm so fortunate that I probably take them for granted. What would I like to call out here? So, I think, I regularly go back into Nelson Mandela's story and what he says and look at that. But actually, the person who I treasure having met most in my life, and I wonder if I've probably got his book somewhere behind me. Yes. I had the great good fortune to meet a couple of times this gentleman, Eddie Daniels.
Okay.
And I was just showing Dave his book, There and Back. Eddie Daniels was imprisoned on Robben Island at the same time as Nelson Mandela. And I met Eddie. I talked to him a few times, and he just blew me away. He was betrayed, basically, by someone close to him, and that was the reason he ended up in Robben Island for 15 years. And he told me one day when we were talking, he said, as soon as I got out of jail, he was banned immediately. He was released from jail. When he could travel, as soon as he could, he said to me, I flew to the UK to find the person who had betrayed me. And I said, why did you do that? Did you want to forgive him? And he said, no, I'd already forgiven him. I just hadn't hugged him yet. And I found that ability to forgive, that depth of character, utterly incredible. And a similar kind of depth of character. I've had the great privilege to meet a couple of times a gentleman called Satish Kumar.
Ah, yes.
Satish walked for peace in the 1960s. For 2.5 years, he walked from India to Moscow, Washington, Paris, and London, I think it was. And as he left, he basically took nothing with him, just trust. And I asked him about that. And how do you set off on a journey and just trust? And I think a lot of leaders I work with, and I count myself in there as well, fear failure, fear it not going well. And success is never certain. But how do you trust enough that you can manage that fear? And Satish was just, he's just a remarkable person. His deep belief in what he does and in the universe that, I think it's privileged to have met those two individuals, Eddie Daniels, Satish Kumar, who really sacrificed themselves for peace and justice.
Yes. Thank you very much. They are truly inspiring stories, and awesome that you've had personal connection with both of those individuals.
Very fortunate indeed. Very fortunate indeed.
So we only have a few minutes left, Tim, but I do want to ask you about your next steps. You have left Unilever after 28 years, and I know you do have something that you're involved in creating. Can you tell us a bit about that? What's next for Tim?
Yeah, so I've set up a company called Chiron. Chiron is a Greek word meaning at the right moment. I think now is definitely the right moment for all kinds of reasons. For, I think, deep leadership development. And so I'm experimenting with all the things we've been discussing and helping organizations to craft the language that they need to describe the leadership that's right for their context, helping them to bring that alive in their organizations. I'm working on deep leadership development, helping leaders to prepare for the senior jobs that are ahead. So those kinds of things, again, coming back to the purpose, nurturing deeply human possibility, experimenting with all different ways of doing that with organizations, top team development work, coaching, immersions, that kind of thing. And at the moment, it's early days, and it's really fun just to, and it's so exciting to talk to new and different organizations about what they need.
Yes. And, whatever organization is blessed to have you involved, they're very lucky. I saw that from the beginning when we first met many years ago. And good luck with your enterprise, but I don't think you need it. I know that wherever you go, you're going to create really wonderful results for the leaders that you work with. So,
well, thanks, Dave, and obviously the same is true for you. I mean, any leader who's working with you as their coach and who's getting your support is also really lucky.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Tim. And for listeners who have been listening in and really enjoyed and have connected with something that you've said today and would like to get in touch, how can people contact you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's a good way. I kind of monitor my messages on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn, and we can take a conversation from there. Cool.
So they just search Tim Munden on LinkedIn?
That's it.
And they'll see your happy face there.
They'll find me. Tim Munden, ex-Unilever, Chiron Leadership. You'll find me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tim. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Dave. Take care.
Thanks for listening. To learn more about how you can evolve as a leader, go to mcdermottcoaching.com.au and enjoy our wide range of articles and resources, as well as our other great podcast episodes.